I used to work as a janitor at a high school. It was only for about a year, back in 2019. The job wasn't too bad at all, but eventually I moved on to other things. Most of the time, I worked overnight shifts, and I was usually alone in the building. My shift would start at 9 p.m. and end at 5 a.m. The school was pretty big, but not so large that I couldn't handle it on my own. Since I had the whole place to myself, I could easily keep up with my cleaning duties. Every now and then, there were events going on at the school when I started my shift, but those people usually left after an hour or two. My job was pretty much what you'd expect: mopping, sweeping, vacuuming, and taking care of the bathrooms. I didn't have to clean every single classroom every night, so some nights were lighter than others. Sometimes I even had downtime where I'd just scroll on my phone for a bit. Honestly, it was a pretty chill job. The only real downsides were working overnight and sleeping during the day, which took some getting used to. The other thing was being completely alone in a huge school at night. Sometimes it got a little creepy. Most of the lights were on, but a lot of them were motion activated, so they'd flick on when I walked by. One night I was in a random hallway cleaning the floors like usual. It was probably around midnight or 1 a.m. I thought I heard footsteps not too far away. I looked around but didn't see anything. The sound could have been coming from around the corner, so I walked over to check. As far as I knew, I was completely alone, like always. When I got to the end of the hallway, I looked around again, but still saw nothing. I shrugged it off and went back to what I was doing. Maybe I was just hearing things. I wasn't totally sure, because it hadn't been very loud. But about 10 minutes later, I heard the footsteps again. This time, I was certain. I looked toward the end of the hallway and saw a man walk by. He passed from one hallway into another, and I only saw him for a couple of seconds before he disappeared. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out much detail, but it was definitely a grown man. I started walking toward where I saw him and called out, asking who was there. Nobody was supposed to be in the building, but no one answered. When I reached the spot where he had been, there was no sign of him. There were other hallways he could have gone down, though. I kept looking around, calling out, but didn't see or hear anything. Not really sure what else to do. I just went back to my work. A few hours later, something even weirder happened. I had moved into a different hallway, and this time I was facing the end of it. Out of nowhere, I heard a noise behind me. I couldn't tell what it was at first. I turned around and saw a basketball rolling straight toward me. It rolled right past me and hit a locker. I looked up to see where it had come from, but once again, no one was there. I figured whoever was in the building had rolled the ball down the hallway and ducked out of sight. But I had no idea why. I picked up the ball, walked to where it had come from, and called out again, asking if anyone was there. Once more, there was no answer. I stood there for about 5 minutes just listening, but didn't hear a single thing. At that point, I was pretty sure someone was deliberately messing with me. But I still didn't understand why, especially since they weren't even supposed to be in the building. So, I went back to work again. The rest of my shift was uneventful. Toward the end, before I finished for the night, I decided to do one last walkthrough of the entire school just to make sure no one was still there. I checked every hallway, every wing, even all the bathrooms, but there was nobody. I didn't hear a single sound, and nobody answered when I called out. At 5 a.m., my shift ended, and the next janitor arrived. I told him about what had happened and asked him to keep an eye out. Then I headed home. At that time, I lived alone in a small house about 10 minutes from the school. I got home and started my usual routine, getting ready for bed, even though it was weird trying to fall asleep at 6 a.m., but I'd gotten used to it. That morning, about 5 minutes after I got home, I was in the kitchen when I heard a knock at the front door. I was instantly confused. I walked over to the living room window and peeked outside. There was no one at the door, but off in the distance, I saw a man walking down the street. I only caught a glimpse of him before he disappeared out of sight. But in that brief moment, it looked like the same guy I'd seen in the school. I was beyond creeped out. I couldn't fall asleep for hours after that. Luckily, though, the man never came back. And nothing like that ever happened again at the school either. Even now, I still wonder who he was and what he was doing there. There was another time when I worked as a janitor in an office building. It was a pretty typical place, several floors, cubicles, the usual. As far as I knew, the building was empty overnight. I was only responsible for cleaning the first floor, vacuuming the carpets, taking out the trash, and tidying up a few areas. This particular story happened during my second week on the job. Up until then, everything had been super easy. I was alone every night, and I usually finished my work with time to spare. But one night, around 2 a.m., I was changing out a trash bag when I suddenly heard glass shatter somewhere in the building. For a few seconds I was frozen, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. It didn't take long to realize what it was. Somebody had broken in, and that meant I could be in serious danger. The sound had come from pretty far away, and with all the cubicles and dividers, I couldn't see anything. I didn't know what to do, so I dropped to the ground and crawled into a nearby cubicle. I hid underneath the desk, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Then I heard footsteps. Someone was inside, walking around, but still not close enough for me to see. I had no idea who broke in or why they were there, but the footsteps started getting closer. I was terrified they somehow knew I was in there. They slowed down a bit, but kept coming in my direction. That's when it finally occurred to me to call the police. But it was so quiet in the building that I was scared even reaching for my phone might give me away. I sat there completely frozen, barely breathing. The person stopped moving and just stood there for what felt like forever. Probably 2 or 3 minutes. Then they started walking again, this time even closer. They got within about 30 feet of me, and I thought any second they might look under the desk and find me. But then they stopped again. I couldn't tell what they were doing, but I didn't dare move. I reached for my phone, but I was so afraid that even the slightest sound might alert them. I stayed like that for what felt like 5 minutes, an eternity in that situation. Finally, I heard them start walking away, back in the direction they came from. Soon, I couldn't hear them at all. I waited another 5 minutes just to be sure they were really gone. Then I finally grabbed my phone and quietly called the police. Even then, I spoke as softly as I could, still unsure if the intruder was nearby. The dispatcher said officers were on their way, and I stayed hidden under the desk while I waited. Eventually, I felt confident enough to come out. Everything in the office looked normal, except for one broken window far away. I didn't know if anything had been stolen. I wasn't familiar with everything in the building, but nothing seemed out of place. The police arrived shortly after, and I told them what happened. They started their investigation, and I was sent home for the night. I returned to work a few days later, and thankfully, nothing like that ever happened again. I never found out who broke in or what they were after. Later, I got a job as a janitor at a university. The campus was a decent size, with a bunch of different buildings. We had a team of janitors, and we each got assigned to certain buildings, though that would change from time to time. My shifts usually ran from the afternoon until late at night. It's ending around 10 or 11 p.m. One night I was working in one of the classroom buildings on the west side of campus. It was kind of isolated near the edge of the property. I arrived after classes had ended for the day. At first, there were still a few students hanging around, studying and such. But as the night went on, the building emptied out. Most nights felt the same, no matter which building I was in. I started cleaning some classrooms, and by around 9 p.m. the place was completely empty. I had about 2 classrooms left to finish. The building had multiple hallways, lounges, and offices. As I made my way down one hallway, I heard footsteps up ahead, going in the same direction I was heading. Then I saw a man walk into view from around the corner, continued walking, and eventually went out of sight. I figured he was just a student studying late, a little unusual, but nothing alarming. I kept going and reached the classroom a minute or two later. The lights were off when I opened the door. After turning them on, the room appeared empty. I brought my cleaning cart inside and started pulling out supplies. Suddenly, I heard a noise to my left, turned, and saw the same man running straight at me, full speed. I barely had time to react, stumbled backward trying to get to the door. As I moved, he grabbed my arm and landed a few hits on my back before crashing into my cleaning cart and falling over. That gave me just enough time to get out of the classroom, but he quickly got up and chased after me. I ran down the hallway and ducked into a nearby bathroom, locking the door behind me. Looking back, I probably should have tried to run outside, but I was afraid he'd catch me before I made it. He reached the door and tried opening it. When that didn't work, he started banging on it hard. Thankfully, I had my phone and called 911 while he kept slamming the door. I didn't say anything while he was outside. I was worried the door might break. even though it was holding up okay. I kept pounding on it relentlessly. Finally, I heard voices in the building. It was the police. They got to him and pulled him away from the door. When I came out, officers were everywhere. Turns out the guy wasn't even a student. Still don't know why he attacked me or chased me like that. Maybe he had been hiding in the classroom all along and didn't he expect anyone to walk in? Who knows? All I know is he was clearly dangerous. Thankfully, nothing like that ever happened again. I worked at that university for about another year before moving on. But that night, definitely one of the craziest moments I've ever experienced on the job.